The damp scent of hemlock and rotting pine needles clung to the three men as they pushed deeper into the Devil's Throat, a jagged ravine that local maps seemed to ignore. Elias, a man whose face was a map of past stresses, led the way, his knuckles white around the handle of a rusted lantern. Behind him, Julian and Mark followed in a tense silence that had replaced their campfire jokes hours ago. They were lifelong friends who had sought the wilderness to escape the noise of the city, but the silence here was different. It wasn't an absence of noise, but a heavy, expectant pressure against their eardrums. The trail hadn't just vanished, it had seemingly folded into the earth. As the sun dipped below the jagged peaks, a low, rhythmic rustling began. It didn't sound like wind in the leaves. It sounded like a heavy, sandpaper tongue licking the bark of the trees around them. "Did you hear that?" Mark whispered, his voice cracking. He stopped to adjust his pack, but as he reached for the strap, he found it wasn't there. His heavy nylon bag hadn't been cut or dropped. It had simply melted into a gray, translucent wax that was now dripping slowly down his spine. "Don't move!" Elias commanded, his lantern flickering violently as the first distant, distorted scream echoed through the ravine. It didn't sound human, but it was using a human's throat to make the sound. The second part of the night began not with a sound, but with a sudden, suffocating shift in the atmosphere. The wax on Mark's back didn't just stay there, it began to hum, a low-frequency vibration that rattled the fillings in their teeth. "My skin, it feels like it's pulling," Mark whimpered, his fingers clawing at the gray substance. As he pulled a strand away, the bark of a nearby oak tree peeled off in sympathy, revealing not wood, but a wet, blinking eye embedded in the trunk. Julian let out a stifled cry and backed away, only to trip over a root that felt remarkably like a human arm. The rustling intensified, evolving from a sandpaper lick to a frantic metallic scraping. It was coming from above. When Elias hoisted the lantern, the light didn't hit branches, it hit a canopy of suspended twitching organs, lungs that breathed in sync with the wind, and hearts that pulsed with a sickening bioluminescent green. "The forest isn't a place anymore," Elias whispered, his voice trembling as he realized their shadows were no longer following their movements. "It's a body." Suddenly, the distorted screaming returned, much closer this time. It wasn't one voice, but a harmonic overlap of their own voices. Elias's command to "don't move" blended with Mark's whimpers, played back at a nauseating high-speed pitch. From the darkness between two bleeding trees, a limb extended. It was 12 feet long, jointed in 6 places, and covered in a fine silver fur that moved like tall grass in a storm. At the end of the limb wasn't a claw, but a perfectly formed porcelain mask of a child's face, which cracked open to emit a cloud of black, stinging spores. The spores didn't just sting. They felt like microscopic needles sewing their eyelids shut. Elias thrashed, swinging his lantern in a desperate arc, but the light only revealed a nightmare that defied every law of biology. The creature, the weaver of marrow, fully pulled itself from the gloom. Its body was a chaotic, translucent mass of gelatinous muscle, shaped like a flattened, upright ribcage that pulsed with an internal, oily light. It had no head, only the porcelain mask hand that had emerged first, and 3 more limbs that ended in rusted, iron-like shears. "Run! To the creek!" Julian shouted, his voice cracking as he grabbed Mark by the arm. But Mark didn't move. He couldn't. The gray wax from his pack had hardened into a calcified shell, anchoring his feet to the forest floor. As they watched in horror, the weaver leaned over him. The creature's central ribs parted like a vertical mouth, and instead of a tongue, a cluster of pale, twitching fingers reached out to stroke Mark's face. The screaming began again, but this time it wasn't a mimicry. It was Mark. As the creature touched him, his reflection in a nearby puddle began to scream in a different direction, his shadow detaching itself from his heels to crawl toward the weaver like a loyal dog.
"Elias! His face!" Julian shrieked. Under the creature's touch, Mark's features were sliding, his nose was migrating toward his cheek, and his eyes were being pulled into a single vertical slit. The Weaver wasn't just killing him, it was re-sculpting him into something that belonged in this breathing forest.
Elias swung the lantern with a guttural roar, the kerosene sloshing inside. The light caught the Weaver's central mass, a cluster of calcified, pulsing honeycombs that served as its heart. The creature didn't flinch. It merely tilted its rib-like torso, and the dozens of human fingers sprouting from its mouth began to snap in a rhythmic, hypnotic cadence. "Leave him! Elias, we have to leave him!" Julian screamed, pulling at Elias's jacket. Mark was no longer screaming. His face had become a smooth, featureless expanse of pale skin, his eyes and mouth completely overgrown by the gray, translucent wax. He stood like a statue, a living pillar of meat being integrated into the forest's structural design. As they turned to bolt into the thicket, the ground beneath them didn't just shake, it inhaled. The forest floor dropped 3 feet, plunging them into a trench of soft, decaying matter that felt like treading through a giant's throat. From the walls of the trench, long black filaments, hair-like and twitching, sprang out, wrapping around Julian's ankles. "It's not a creature, Elias!" Julian gasped as he was dragged toward a hole in the earth that looked like a giant weeping pore. "The creature is just a limb. The whole valley is one single—" A sudden wet thwack silenced him. A second Weaver, smaller and more spindly, dropped from the canopy. This one had no porcelain mask. Its head was a cluster of rusted antique scissors that clicked and snapped with a sound like 1,000 angry beetles. It didn't strike at Julian's throat. It reached out and snipped his shadow clean off the ground. Julian collapsed instantly, his body becoming limp and gray, as if the very essence of his weight had been stolen. Elias stood alone in the trench, the lantern's flame dying down to a blue, flickering ghost.
The lantern's flame gave one final violent sputter and died, plunging Elias into a world of absolute, suffocating black. He stood frozen in the trench, the silence more terrifying than the screams. It was a silence that felt alive, pressing against his skin like a heavy, cold hand. From the dark, he heard the sound of Julian's body, or what used to be Julian, being dragged upward. It wasn't a struggle, it was the sound of something being woven into the fabric of the trees. The scissors clicked once, twice, and then a new sound emerged, the rhythmic, wet thumping of a giant heart beating beneath his feet. Elias didn't run. He knew now that there was no way to run to. He reached out, his hand brushing against the trench wall, and felt not dirt, but the warm, pulsing texture of a giant tongue. Suddenly, the valley lit up with a sickening bioluminescent surge. High above, the Weaver of Marrow had finished its work. Mark and Julian were no longer men. They had been stretched and fused together into a new arching gateway of bone and translucent skin. The creature itself stood atop the arch, its porcelain-masked hand waving a slow, graceful goodbye. Elias looked down at his own hands. They were beginning to turn gray, his skin smoothing over as his fingers fused together into a single, sharp point. He wasn't being eaten, he was being refined. The strange rustling he had heard all night was simply the sound of the world's most terrifying artist preparing a fresh canvas. As his vision blurred into a singular vertical slit, Elias felt a strange, hollow peace. The forest exhaled one last time, and the devil's throat closed its mouth for the night, leaving the valley looking perfectly, terrifyingly still once more.